presentation of Behind the Books,
Ricky,
Caltech's new series for authors. Can you all hear me all right? I hope, and they are advising me to tell you to watch this on speaker view, and that'll give you the best reception with so many people joining in. This is a brand new series that Caltech's Public Programming Office is offering, and we're really proud to be starting with the author Blake Hill Sawyer, covering her book, Erin McDuffie Moore, a book about her great-great-grandfather, who was the first Black physician in Durham, North Carolina. And the book was published by University of North Carolina Press, and you're going to be hearing all about it in just a few minutes. I want to start by thanking our sponsors, the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, and all of you can join the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, and also the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union. They've been supporting us for many, many years and make all of these programs possible. If you would like to get infrequent emails from our office letting you know about the other events that we're working on, you can sign up at events.caltech.edu. And you're certain to hear about our next big program, which is going to be a screening for about 2 weeks. We're going to be screening the film A Weekend with Pablo Picasso. Los Angeles actor, director, screenwriter, scriptwriter, Herbert Siguenza, familiar to many of you from the Culture Clash comedy troupe that is based here in Los Angeles, has created a remarkable play that San Diego Repertory Theater turned into a movie, and we'll be showing it starting on March 6th. For our donors, there's going to be a special meet and greet on the 16th of February. So we encourage all of you who would like to participate in that meet and greet to look into joining the Friends of Beckman Auditorium. The next two of our Behind the Book reading programs are going to feature authors who have been dealing with the brain. And the next one on April 12th will feature Indra Viscontis being interviewed by one of our performing and visual art faculty members, Maya Jasper White. She has written a book about the brain and how it hears certain kinds of sounds and makes them music to us. It should be a fascinating program, and we hope you'll join us then on April 12th for that one. I want to just cover quickly, we're going to have a format where we're going to let Monique Thomas from our Center for, Caltech Center for Inclusion and Diversity is going to be talking with and interviewing Blake. And after about 35 minutes of their having a conversation, we're going to open it up so that everyone who's watching can also join in and ask questions and make comments. The books, we're going to give you some information shortly about how you can order books, and someday when we're all able to gather together again, we're going to have a party with all of our authors, and they'll be doing a signing party. So you bring your books and they'll be bringing pens, and we'll be able to sign books for all of you. Now it gives me great pleasure to turn this over to Monique Thomas, who will carry on the program for us. Monique?
Good evening, everyone, or good night, depending on where you are. My name again is Monique Thomas. I'm program coordinator at the Caltech Center for Inclusion and Diversity, and it is my honor today to introduce our author, Blake Hill Sawyer. And I wanted to just say quickly that we were in partnership with Caltech Live for this event. This is one of a few of our Black History events that will be going on this month for the Caltech Center for Inclusion and Diversity. And so we have incredible speakers that are coming. We're doing on February the 26th, a history of Black Pasadena. And so there's a long, rich history of the Black community in Pasadena. So I do recommend that if you are able to go to that. And towards the end of our talk, we'll have references in the chat so that you can sign up for our newsletter. So right now I would like to introduce Blake Hill Sawyer.
Hello.
Hello. And so I'm actually going to read your bio quickly. Blake Hill Sawyer is a published author, writer, verbal branding muse, and storytelling coach based in Los Angeles. The biracial daughter of two professors of English literature, Hill Sawyer has always been surrounded by books and the craft of writing. Her parents made their living early as typesetters, so her childhood memories are set against the constant onslaught of an IBM typewriter. Wonderful. Hill Sawyer's first career was in classical music as an international hard-traveling operatic soprano. On the stage and the concert hall, she honed her research skills and ability to embody historical characters, as well as her affinity for communication. When the COVID-19 shutdown caused all live music to stall, Sawyer leaned into her writing, a full-time career founding Tenacity Communications, a verbal branding, storytelling, and executive copywriting service, which helps a wide range of nonprofit, for-profit companies and for-profit companies, craft new language of leadership. Her articles and blog can be found in the Merrick Washington magazine and in various online publications. She's developing several fiction and nonfiction manuscripts, all rooted in the Reconstruction era. So it is my honor to welcome Blake Hill Sawyer today.
It's my honor to be with you, Monique.
So many things that actually came up in your bio will be things that we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into. But the first one, I know that with obviously with the COVID-19, it's changed our lives, but obviously you had started this research long before this time. So I just kind of wanted to get into this rich story of Dr. Moore. And if you haven't read the book, I recommend that you read it because it's amazing. But I wanted to get into the timing. Why now? When you started to write the story of your great-great-grandfather, obviously his story had been in your life for a while. Why did you decide to write it at this time?
Well, honestly, this book has been kind of in my imagination and in my life since the minute I could form a sentence on a page. My family and the Black side of my family has always kind of been an Atlantis-like story to me. There always seemed to be, a mystery behind every corner. I used to actually have a recurring dream where I would go back to my to the 606 Fayetteville Street that I write about. That's Dr. Moore's house, that is no longer in existence in old Hayti in Durham, and I would go into the house and open different doors and have different adventures. So even as a child, that was so far down inside my imagination and myself. It's almost as if my DNA was causing me to dream this lost world that is the lost Black middle class of the post-Reconstruction era. So my mother was also a literary criticism writer and definitely the literary scholar in the family. And she was really supposed to be the one who wrote this book. But we unfortunately lost her to cancer at age 43. And so that kind of legacy fell, I guess, to me, being the other writer in the family. My father also writes, but is less forthcoming with his drafts, and so he's a wonderful writer, and so I took on the dream of the project with my aunt Eileen, my mother's sister, C. Eileen Watts Welch, who became the president of the board of an organization called the Durham Colored Library Incorporated. That is actually the library that Dr. Moore founded in 1913. It's now a nonprofit that is a narrative organization that deals with healing the narrative of Black history and elevating the stories of Black life. And also in educational initiatives. And this initiative came up. There was some talk of having a memorial or some kind of plaque or situation to honor Dr. Moore. And then the idea of a biography came up, and we really leaned into that as a way of spending time with him and a way of collecting all of the aspects of him that were already part of Black history because of his involvement with Durham's Black Wall Street. But also there was no central place really for that to be visited with, and also no place in which his true personality was able to shine. And so as time went on, my great-grandmother actually made some tapes because she also always talked about wanting to have a book about her father. So she sat down with a friend of the family, Meredith Holmes, and taped some interviews in the 80s when I was just a teenager. And those tapes actually became so much of the heart of this book because it added that family voice that was unique to us that we could add to what was already part of history. And then finally, when it became possible to have grant money to support me while I was able to take the time away from other things and put a roof over my head and do this research, the grant money came available, and the board chose me to carry this project forward. And I actually found out about it on my wedding day. My aunt, C. Eileen Watts Welch, was in attendance and pulled me aside in my bride's room just before I was about to process down the aisle. And she said, "You're going to be an author too. You're going to be a wife today, but you're also going to be an author." And it kind of conflated in my imagination right at that moment that so many thresholds were crossed. And it was really just, that was just the beginning. This became a 7-year process. So the way that it seems like it is, in some senses prescient, so much of what this book has to offer is a bit prescient to the current political moment. But really, we started it 7 years ago, 8 years ago now. And that process grew over time. And then lastly, I was very honored to be part of the UNC Press family as they accepted the initial manuscript, but also went through a very rigorous peer review process in which not only did I need to bring the academic value of the book up to their standards, but also delve really far into really some history that was so indicative of the moment, which is the history of white supremacy in this nation and the history of what was, conflated with the American dream and how that became kind of a shorthand for the rise of white supremacy. And so researching that during the years of 2017, 2018 into 2019 really caused this experience to become very deep and very rigorous for me. And I'm grateful for the time that it took so that I was able to do that level of edits during that time so that I could really speak to the current moment while I was doing this research. So very long answer to the fact that it was always in my heart, but the opportunity really came later. And then to be able to be editing it academically during this past administration was really quite a privilege, but also a real responsibility.
Thank you, Blake. And you talk so beautifully about history and just this process, and we are so much the result of our histories, of the histories of our family, the history of this country. And one of the moments in history, eras of history that I'm most fascinated by, and that's why I just so loved your book, is the Reconstruction Era. I do feel like that for African Americans, it was sort of a missed opportunity for this country to really sort of reconcile and really build on opportunities. But somehow during that time, Dr. Moore was able to study medicine and became a doctor. And so can you talk a little bit about that experience of Dr. Moore, but also just sort of Black professionals during the Reconstruction time?
It's hard to not feel like it's deliberate that we have left the Reconstruction era out of most of our historical study of civil rights, because there really was a pocket of time, and I'm talking maybe 20 years, maybe less, of time in which the possibilities and the advancement of Black people post-emancipation was really meteoric, and especially in the South. And so the programs that Northern philanthropy and religious organizations were able to put into organization in the South to educate people as quickly as possibly they could. There was a meteoric rise in literacy in the Black population. There were so many initiatives to not only educate within communities, but then to educate Black teachers to then go back into those communities so that Black children were not necessarily learning from white teachers. And then on top of that, the higher education, because you had to educate Black teachers, you had to give them teaching education, which at this time was called the normal school course, which was a teacher training. And then to go above the teacher training at a university level, those universities started opening up. But because there was a distaste for Black students at the university level, we then began to found what we call HBCUs these days, which were historically Black universities, many of which began as religious organizations because they could get funding for Black education if they couched it in religion, but also because religion was definitely a more prevalent part of Black life at that time. So it was certainly an acceptable thing. It was not imposed on people, but it was definitely a better way to raise Northern white money to say that it was a religious organization than to say, for instance, we are educating Black doctors. So Aaron Moore had this extraordinary ability, or just positioning in his life, to literally look. It seems to me in my research that his foot would just step up and a rung would appear under his foot, nearly at the really at the moment he needed it. Something would appear that will allow him to climb slightly higher. And there were many times in which he had to return home and return to the farm that he grew up on, that influenced his life tremendously and that made him able to pursue higher education. We must also remember that there was money involved. He came from a family that owned their land, worked their land, and reaped the benefit of their land as free Blacks, with landowning Blacks. So he had the opportunity to work, save money, and be able to have education. But also that education kind of appeared and was made available to him almost the moment that he was able to access it. The medical course being definitely an example of that, because when he arrived at Shaw University to become a teacher, he wanted to teach at the university level. He had done the teacher training course. He arrived at Shaw University and they had only just begun teaching one other class ahead of him in this Leonard Medical School that was really the dream of the founder of Shaw. He had been a medic and a priest in the Civil War and saw this tremendous need for Black physicians. And so when he founded Shaw, he always had in his mind that he would like a Black medical school, and he fought very, very hard to keep that alive. So when Leonard became possible, and when Aaron Moore arrived at Shaw, I believe that they nearly immediately took him aside and said, "You are exactly the kind of student that we need in this program. Your race needs you, your people need you, your community needs you, and you are the kind of pre-prepared and obviously fast-learning student that we need to prove that this is possible." Because at the same time that they were raising money to keep Leonard in moving forward as an institution, they were also constantly proving that Blacks could even learn science, could even learn medicine. And if you look at also at this time, this is kind of sandwiched between polygenesis, which was this scientific community that said that, Blacks actually evolved from a different place than whites. Scientifically, there was all this, made up, essentially, science that was going along with that. And then, the coming argument of eugenics later. So sandwiched between polygenesis and eugenics, you have these classes of Black medical students who are entering a profession that really only years ahead of them was essentially diuretics and bloodletting. And suddenly, Joseph Lister is introducing antiseptic surgery, and germ theory is coming on the scene, and forensics and the study of flora and fauna, and all of these extraordinary moments in science in general are happening, and in medicine in general. And then by the time he actually graduates in 3 years, not 4, from his medical degree, he's only the second class to sit for the state boards. There was no board certification. Even for the white doctors that were his professors, his white professors were not board certified. And yet he sat for the boards as one of a field of 42, 2 of which only were Black. And he finished at the top of that field. So we're talking about a time in which medicine itself was being regulated, medicine itself was being revolutionized, and on top of that, he was constantly having to prove that he was capable of even learning this, much less practicing it. So it's an extraordinary time, and he was literally at the leading edge of it. But I can only imagine that just had to take so much guts and so much, as we have talked about before, grit and determination and ingenuity to keep moving forward. And that's always what fascinates me about his story and about him, and always has been at the bottom of my curiosity about him, is why did he keep moving forward when he had really no empirical evidence that would work out? But he didn't falter, kept walking forward.
Wow, that's amazing. And I can't imagine that even today with the challenges that we have, let alone during that time. But it was such an interesting time, that intersection between all of these incredible scientific advancements and how we're moving in that direction. And then it's during Reconstruction. It was sort of this incredible moment for
Mm.
Black scholars and particularly Black scientists. And there were challenges around racism. And in your book, you beautifully talk about just sort of the challenges of getting funding for Leonard and Shaw. And so I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit more about sort of that fundraising piece and what that process was like for those folks back then, just to get funding to have a Black medical school.
Well, I was so privileged through my partnership on this project with my auntie, Eileen Watts Welch, who really produced the project, but also was so extraordinary in reaching out and forming the relationships in the community that we needed in order to get doors open to us, because so much of this research is really in little pockets everywhere, and some of it's privately owned and some of it's in different collections. So it's not really very readily available. It's really kind of in layers. So we had found that there were some things at Shaw that we really needed to see in the Shaw archives, and they really had not been open for years. In fact, the last person who really delved into the history of Leonard had really gone into that archive in the 80s. So we were able to gain access to the archive, which we had to go in completely masked because there might have been mold in there. They weren't sure, and there was some stuff going on. And, we were able to gain access. We were so honored to do so. And so as I'm going through some of these records, Martin Tupper is the founder of Shaw. And some of Martin Tupper's correspondence, there's literally a journal of him, all of the places he went to raise money. And so he has lists of who he's going to go see and what happened and what that, little notes about how the interaction went and if he's going to go back and if money came through. And so you can see that this man is just in this constant struggle to keep this organization up and alive. And so a lot of what he did was kind of play a shell game. So he would fund Shaw as the religious organization that it was. And by the way, so much of what Leonard and Shaw projected as their student body was this highly respectable, very religious, extremely rigorous, very high standards of conduct. So much of even being admitted was to be considered a young man of high and moral character. So even when he advertises this organization and the school, he's saying we're looking for good Christian men of high moral character to take on this study. So he knew that he had to project this image of the highest possible, most rigorous, highest moral character, most straight-laced, absolutely no smoking, no drinking, no socializing, no fraternizing, suits, ties, shined shoes, everything, every hair in place, always making their way to chapel, always finding their way to the dining room, always studying, in certain places and being at certain places and certain times. So much of what the product of Shaw and of Leonard was this highly respectable, straight-laced, very, very religious, young man who was going to come and be an asset to your community, not only medically, but morally. And so he had to sell that so hard in order to get people to invest in this. And even then, he really had a difficult time because people didn't think that Blacks could even learn science. So then he would say, I tell you what, if you would endow, a janitorial scholarship for a young man to be able to do janitorial work on campus so that he can get his education, he wouldn't be clear about what that education was. But he would get somebody a janitorial job that they would be like, oh yes, well, good solid janitorial work is good for them. We'll endow that, but we won't endow a medical scholarship. So he found ways of persuading people to give money in ways that he would kind of just move that shell game around and keep the medical school going. It always lost money. It was always limping along. And then finally it was closed by something called the Flexner Report, which is a whole different show. But this man named Flexner went around examining Black medical schools in particular and closed every one of them except for Meharry and Howard. And there was a whole list of reasons why. It was, whether they had a teaching theater for surgery or this, that, or the other. It was a very high bar to meet, and Leonard was constantly up against it, always made it until when the door closed and all of these Black medical schools were closed. And this was largely because they were too good. They were coming out, they were too good. They were taking clients from white doctors. They were board certified when some white doctors weren't. And then had to be, and they resented that as well. They resented having to be board certified. So there was professional problems and competition, and so Leonard eventually suffered from the closures of the Flexner Report. And Dr. Moore fought that every step of the way. He gave money. The minute he left that organization, he began giving money back, and even on his death, he was the largest Black donor back to Shaw in history up until his point. He left them $5,000 on his death, which is, probably, what is that, $50,000 today, upon his death in 1923. An extraordinary legacy. So he cared.
Wow, and that whole idea of what you were talking about earlier, my next question, we're going to sort of get into the economics of it in Black Wall Street, but I want to sort of get into, again, Dr. Moore. Students now that we have at Caltech and just sort of Black folks around the world are faced with issues of respectability politics, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to be of a certain moral standard, you have to be perfection, and sort of representative of your entire race. And there's something that you refer to in the book. You talk about his grit and ingenuity. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know that he had, his family were landowners, but he still had come from a farming community and was sort of trying to move on. Can you talk a little bit about that grit and ingenuity and maybe how that would reflect on current students today, current students of color, particularly Black students?
Well, absolutely. I think so much of when I look at his life and I look at the trajectory of his life, everything that he was able to achieve, both for himself and his community, had to do with this inner life that he constantly cultivated and this inner engine of creativity, resources, resilience. He was just able to kind of concentrate himself back inward almost on a daily basis. He was, known to sit every morning in a kind of meditation and read his Bible and just be with himself. He was very good at pulling that in and dealing with his inner world and then using that as this propellant forward. His inner moral compass, his inner compass as to what was possible, his inner belief, his inner voices, his tremendous faith, all of those impetuses within him, he was able to focus in on and continue to move forward without a lot of reference to outside forces. And I think that if nothing else, that is an extraordinary message to anyone of today, but particularly to students of today, who are, particularly in this COVID crisis, in really unfamiliar territory and really unfamiliar, they don't know what the future is going to bring. None of us really know what our next steps are. But if we focus ourselves inward and find that source of inner resilience, find that source of interconnectivity to other human beings, find that place of moral character where we want something larger than ourselves and we believe in our possibility to be part of a larger good than just ourselves and our selfishness. So often I think, he could have stopped at being a farmer. He was gonna be okay. He could have stopped at being a country school teacher. He was already great at that. He could have stopped at being a teacher and stayed in the university system and not gone to medical school. He would have been great at that. He could have stopped at just being a doctor. When he got to Durham after having built a practice for 6 years and really gained the people's trust, he could have stopped there. He could have been a very successful physician. He could have founded the hospital and stayed in medicine. Instead, he moved into entrepreneurial endeavors with the mighty triumvirate of John Merrick and C.C. Spalding. He was always looking for the next way
Everyone's back.
of
Best
benefit.
parking I've ever seen in my life.
So he was constantly referring to that inner voice, and he was constantly moving according to that inner voice. And I believe that was very much his faith, but I also believe it was very much his belief in himself. So that grit, when you grow up on a farm, when everything is interrelated, if you don't get up and feed the animals in the morning, something terrible goes wrong. There's a domino effect. If you don't do your part on a farm, if you don't care for the creatures and the people who depend on you, things go wrong. Terrible things go wrong. And so the interdependentness of people and animals and nature and the science of that is very apparent in farming life. And so I think that, combined with his faith and combined with his relentless curiosity, were the things that carry him through. And I think, honestly, that can apply to any life today, but particularly in this moment where we all have to pull it in, concentrate our awareness of what really matters, and then use our creativity, our ingenuity, and our grit to move forward in innovation and get to that leading edge.
Thank you, Blake. And that idea of interconnectedness and the farm, it seems like he took that idea and then when he became successful, used that to sort of create Black Wall Street and really this connection for Black economic development. A lot of people recently have found out, other folks knew about it before, that Black Wall Street, the only Black Wall Street that I knew of was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and sort of the violence that happened there. I had not heard of the success of Durham. And so just if you could talk a little bit about Dr. Moore's ability to sort of create this Black Wall Street, this dynamic Black economic development in that area.
First of all, Black Wall Street in Durham actually predates Oklahoma, Tulsa. And then predating Durham was Wilmington. Wilmington was really one of the first, Wilmington, North Carolina, was really one of the first upwardly mobile, truly with Black representation, both in government, in law enforcement, and in economic forces kind of city. And when we had the Wilmington coup, which is the last successful political coup on American soil in 1898, Wilmington and the massacre that ensued at that time really affected how particularly Durham carried forward in their statesmanship between the races. And also it was a bit different. Durham, a lot of survivors from Wilmington moved to Durham. So there was an influx of talent and population into the Durham area. But I think also at that moment in 1898, when it became clear that politically Black people were not going to become able to continue having representation in government because there was such a backlash and there was this retaking from the radical, away from radical Republicans, which of course are the Democrats of today, to the Southern Democratic Party, which are the Republicans of today. There was this, taking back of the governmental systems at that time in 1898, and there was a real change. And that's really where Reconstruction ended in the South, and where it became clear that you were going to have to build your own. And the concept of separate but equal became, a way of looking at how to carry forward, which led, of course, into Jim Crow and what takes us into the next round of 20, 30 years before we get to what many people begin to start thinking about as the civil rights movement. But when we have this moment of Wilmington falling in this bloody coup, and Durham looking at how they can create interdependent relationships, particularly because white businesses needed skilled Black labor, particularly because there were co-ownerships of enterprises and ways of working together that made it a more successful but also a safer situation for Durham's Black Wall Street and Durham's Hayti area. Hayti was named after the Free State of Haiti. A lot of Black neighborhoods at this time were named after the Free State of Haiti because of its revolution, successful revolution and self-governance in a Southern accent that was called Hayti. So Durham's Hayti was the Black community in Durham, and they were able to, I think, also really through not emphasizing a lot of flashiness with their success, because they constantly took what was their economic success and reinvested it into each other and into the community and into their infrastructure. There was less kind of visible prosperity and more just deep community that when we get to Tulsa and Greenwood, there was a lot of very ostentatious wealth in the Greenwood community. There was and that attracted a lot of hatred and jealousy from particularly the poor white community. And so when there was that backlash, it had been brewing quite a long time, because they had beautiful green lawns and grand pianos and beautiful shiny cars and a beautiful shopping district and their own schools and their own fire department and their own whole community that was going better in a lot of ways. And that was visibly happening. I think Durham's Hayti community was much more low profile, and there was much more going on behind the scenes, statesmanship wise, particularly Dr. Moore being a real proponent of this, where they kept things tenuously okay. And so, for instance, the Duke family did a lot of philanthropy and investment in Hayti organizations like Lincoln Hospital, like the library. And because Dr. Moore was able to help them see that that was the way to make themselves, as socially responsible, visibly socially responsible as they would like to appear, and that was a good thing for the whole community, both white and Black, and that actually having a freestanding Black hospital kept Black patients out of the white hospital. I mean, he let that be known as well. There was this, statesmanship going on that allowed people to move forward with cordial relationships as long as they stayed on their side and as long as nobody made a big deal about their success. And so thrift was definitely a big proponent of many of Dr. Moore's speeches about investment in the community and thrift and upwardly mobile initiatives that helped everyone. Was definitely more of what he pushed, and less of frippery and shininess and ostentatious wealth.
Great. I actually have one more question that's sort of around building of Black hospitals and the perception of the more of root doctors versus European trained doctors. And if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of the suspicion and trepidation that patients had with moving from root doctors to European trained doctors.
Well, I think there has been a long-standing and understandable and historically fraught relationship between the Black community and the medical community. And so when you have a European trained Black doctor come to your neighborhood, as Dr. Moore did in 1888 in Durham, there was some trust building that had to happen. You have to understand that up until this point, all childbearing was taken care of under the auspices, of midwives. Root doctors were, I guess, what we would refer to now as kind of quack doctors, definitely, but that could go either way, right? There are certainly some practices ancient practices of medicine that we even use today that go back to tribal knowledge and knowledge of the natural world and natural remedies. So root doctors were really the doctors that administered under slavery to the slave populations that they trusted more than the white doctors, because generally in slave populations, white doctors were used to keep people working, frighten them into working, torture them into working, do experiments on them, determine whether they could stay with their families, determine whether they could continue to work, determine their childbearing ability. So really, when you saw a doctor coming and you were in the slave population, bad things were coming. And so taking that kind of DNA of that relationship and moving that forward, even several generations, the distrust is profound. So when Dr. Moore was building trust in this community that had never seen a Black doctor before, and in many cases across the nation, there are many accounts of Black doctors having a tremendously difficult time getting the trust of their populations. A lot of the trust building had to do with, for instance, being in church every Sunday, having the pastor introduce him, going on a rounds in the neighborhood, whether people had called or not, if you had success with one patient, making sure that the success was family-wide. Initially, when he first came to Durham, he was growing vegetables and selling produce in order to survive. He had a little farmhouse himself, and he was running a vegetable stand on the side of the road to get by, because doctoring was not a lucrative living. Even when people did have him come, he might come home with a chicken or a bottle of milk or, some onions to pay for his services. Very rarely did he get paid in cash. We know this because I actually found his visiting book, one of my best achievements as a researcher. I found the visiting book that he used in his first year of medicine in 1888 in Durham. And it's written down who he saw, what he saw them for, if they paid him, what they paid him in, what he prescribed. So there's this extraordinary record of the origin of Black medicine in Durham that we found in a box mislabeled. I just had a feeling about it. So that was a great moment. That being said, building that trust, when he would go and see a patient, he would bring firewood or coal if they had a coal burning furnace. He would bring soap. He would bring non-spoiled, good quality food or the produce that he grew. He would make sure that not only did someone, have a cure for the cut that they had or the rash that they had or the fever that they had, but also that their family was able to eat and that they were able to rest and be warm and be clean. So a lot of his ideas about infrastructure for Durham had to do with the fact that he was going house to house and seeing what people really needed and understanding those needs had to be met before people could become real citizens. And so when he looks, when we fast forward to the time where he's forming this infrastructure, it's very much like W.B. Du Bois talks about being a whole person in the eyes of the world, not only being a person who is surviving, not only being a person who is useful, but being a person who has gotten past survival enough to be able to have dreams, to be able to want to read a book about something that isn't just how to do something, to have the time to make music or to paint or to have a dream that's bigger than going to a job and coming home, being able to save enough to pay for your children's education, being able to save enough to have a funeral, being able to put your money someplace that nobody's going to steal it, just very basic, personhood. And so much of what his doctoring was about was restoring that personhood. And so when you have a doctor that sees their patients as a person and sees all of their needs as contributing to their pathology, then you have someone who is interested in curing a community, in uplifting the health of a community. And in many ways, he probably added 10 years to the life expectancy of Durham in that first 6 years of his doctoring.
Thank you so much, Blake. This is so great. What an incredible life and story. So we want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions of us as well, of Blake and of
Please.
myself. I want to introduce our house manager, Corinne Shore. And so if you have any questions, you will go to the participant. Actually, no, it isn't. It's reactions, and you'll click on the hand raise. And you can virtually raise your hand, or you can put your question in the chat. So if you have a question, because there's so many of us, we can't see you, go ahead and raise your hand virtually, or put your comment in the chat.
And if folks also want to go into gallery mode and turn on your videos, feel free, so that we can see each other as we gather for this question portion. Feel free to do that.
I'm loving seeing all the faces that I'm seeing already.
All right, does anyone have a question? Not a question, but in the chat we are seeing there are some cousins present.
Oh, hello, cousins. I can't see everyone's faces, but I love it when there's cousins. The Benjamin and Edith Spalding family organization is thousands strong. There are so many of us, and it's one of the best parts about writing this book and about presenting around this book and Dr. Moore's life is that my family has grown exponentially, the family that I am aware of, because I keep meeting all of these amazing cousins. And every time I meet a Spalding Moore cousin, they are always in some amazing aspect of service. So there's something in this DNA that is driven to serve. And I'm so proud of every time I meet another extraordinary Spalding cousin. So hello, cousins.
Good DNA. So let's start with Kate. Kate, you have your hand raised.
Hi. Oh, great lecture. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you went about the research and, having a feeling about that box and finding his visiting booklet and the kind of hours that you spent doing that. That would be terrific. Thank you so much again.
Oh, thank you. And what a great question. And I'm so glad you asked it because honestly, I'm now addicted to this process. There is nothing more exciting than archaeologically revealing these extraordinary things. And when you know someone's story and you find an artifact of their life and you are able to hold it or see it, or, even just seeing his handwriting on a page is so emotional for me. So that's been really just the most joyful part of this process. So thank you for bringing that up because anybody who wants to go into their own story and their own background and really delve into their family history, I wish for you this kind of joy because it is just exponential and it stays with you. So what I discovered particularly about this era of history and about Black history in general is that it really is there are layers. So there's the layer that's pretty readily available, through any number of different kind of search engines. So there's a lot out there, and then you start seeing that a lot of that is cross-referenced with each other, and so you start seeing the same kind of statements in that layer. And then you have the interpretive layer of those who have used those references to write other things. So there are some really great interpretive layers. I really benefited from the work of Todd Savitt, for instance, who wrote extensively on Black medical schools and particularly on Leonard Medical School. One of these days, I'm going to hug that man because he really, really came through in so many ways, not only as a supporter of my work. I wrote to him and he wrote me back and sent me some books that I actually hadn't found yet of his. But also he went in there and got this when it's so difficult to get to. So he was the last one, for instance, in the Shaw archives. And so he was the one who really inspired me to really push to get in there myself. So then there's that layer. And then really when I had consolidated all of that, and then there's the family layer of kind of apocryphal stuff, the recordings that we have, the memories that other people have. And then when people start, when you contact people enough, or when you give presentations like this, all of a sudden people are like, oh, you know what? I think I have a letter from Dr. Moore that my great grandmother kept in a book, like, so people will start kind of, things will start erupting out in the community of just these little eruptions of information, or somebody will find a picture, or because they know you're doing this, suddenly they'll start sending you things. So then there's that layer that just kind of, precipitates through your research. And then when I got to the visiting book, it was when I discovered that if I started cross-referencing, for instance, people of his time period that would have larger collections, like, for instance, W.B. Du Bois, I have a number of letters between him and Dr. Moore because W.B. Du Bois has a pretty tremendous collection of all of his correspondence that's well kept and well managed. So if you go to people's who have well-managed collections and cross-reference that with your person, very likely you'll pop up something. So that was cool. And then also I cross-referenced him with C.C. Spalding's collection of papers at the Rubenstein Library at Duke University, which is a beautiful and wonderful and deep collection of Black history. Thank goodness for them, because they have really, really made an effort to keep this stuff. But C.C. Spalding's papers are there. And because he was the younger of the three of this triumvirate, a lot more of his papers were preserved. Also, he was somebody who understood the weight of the history that he carried and benefited from. So he also kept quite an archive of his own at the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, as he was president after the two of them. And so I cross-referenced Dr. Moore in C.C. Spalding's papers. And then there was just something in this box that was labeled Aaron's book. And I just had a feeling about it. Could have been, lots of people were named Aaron after Dr. Moore. It wasn't necessarily him, but I said, I think we should pull that box. And so I asked my aunt, C. Eileen Watts Welch, to make that appointment and take her time out of her day and go look at this mysterious box at something that could have been nothing. And I remember her calling me just in tears, saying, oh my God, we found this thing. It's Aaron's book. It's his visiting book. Everything's in here. And she was sending me these pictures from her cell phone, because you can't take it out of the archive, obviously, and you can't really scan it because it's old. So she was taking cell phone pictures, but they were all shaky because her hands were shaky. So I was like, okay, we need to we gotta. So finally we got these amazing scans of this. And so I'm able to spend time with him in his day as a doctor, as a young doctor, as a new doctor, and knowing how scary that must have been for him, and to do that by himself and to just figure out what it was going to be. So those are the layers. And so I encourage you, when you're doing research, to not only do the obvious stuff, but to start, once you know the players or know the people surrounding your person, who might also have repositories of information or collections, start hitting those up as a cross-reference, because that's when you start getting the information in between. And some of those in-between sources are delicious.
Wonderful. Let's go to Chuck. Chuck has his hand raised.
Well, thank you so much for this interview, first of all, but I'm wondering if you can recommend a history book that looks at the ramp up of Reconstruction and its disassembly. I mean, in my head, all I know is the Klan, but I'm sure there were other social and political forces involved, and I'd like to get some knowledge on that. Is
Oh
there a
my
book you could
goodness.
recommend?
I have a number of recommendations, and I think, well, I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates has written some extraordinary history. I think that's a wonderful place to start with anything that he has written. And then there are a couple, let's see. I honestly think that he's a really great place to start because it is the most modern and the most, it's called Stamped from the Beginning, Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Thank you.
It is the most, with the most modern take and sensibility and lens through which to look at history. I think he's a really rigorous and really clear and very readable, but also extremely modern in his way of looking at it. Because you also, when you look at some of these historical compilations, some of them can be a bit dated in their focus or in their lens, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I just think his is a really fresh voice. So I think I would recommend that most.
Thank you.
Thank you for
We
asking.
have a question from Julia Zuckerman written in the chat. What can you tell us about the women in Dr. Moore's life and their influence on him?
Thank you so much for asking. You know, this man was surrounded by great women, and he was really quite ahead of his time in the sense that he really nurtured the women around him. He taught a tremendous amount of nurses in his nursing school that was attached to Lincoln Hospital. He had 2 daughters that he made sure were educated to the highest level, both of them, and were encouraged to be scholars in their own right. He actually graduated from medical school with the obstetrics prize, having been really a very good student and a very caring student in the area of women's medicine, which, if you can just think, I mean, women's medicine was at its very infancy at this time. Like, barely were we even scratching the surface of women needing a different kind of medicine at all, of childbirth even being supervised by a male person at all. And so for him to be as focused on, mothers and children and safe delivery of children and, safe after, well baby programs after birth and, well mothers. He was really very, very focused on women and their healthcare, and then women's careers in healthcare. He supported the education of several nurses, many of whom he would have even come and stay in the house. He would pay for their education. He would encourage their efforts in missionary work. He was really somebody that respected women tremendously. And then he married this amazing woman, Cotty, Sarah Makata Dancy Moore, who in and of herself was this woman who was able to, early on in his doctoring career, learn how to sterilize instruments, assist him in surgery, mop up the blood, because of course his house was the hospital, before there was a hospital, handle the hysterical parents of, wounded or sick children, just generally be everything that surrounded, every team that surrounds a surgeon or a doctor. She was that team, all by herself. And learning that without, she had definitely had schooling. She had the normal course, but she had certainly not studied to be a nurse. So she was able to take that on and then take on the federated clubs, which were these Black women's clubs who were extraordinarily influential in the community. They kind of were the glue between all of the programs that were needed. For instance, at Lincoln Hospital, they were the ones who went out and made sure that people were okay after they left the hospital. They were the ones who rolled bandages, who sterilized sheets, who welcomed people in the waiting room and made them feel at home. And so that a hospital didn't become a place that you went to die. It was a place that you went to become better, or to, have your baby, or to check in with the doctor. They made that home around the hospital, and they made all of the volunteer work surrounding the hospital possible. So they were really this force. And then they actually became the suffragist movement for Black women when that, became a thing. The federated clubs were really the place where that suffragist organizational effort began. Were in these women's clubs. And Dr. Moore absolutely knew the power of that. And so when he needed an initiative moved forward, or if he needed, people to learn how to, in their own pandemic, by the way, they had the blue plague that swept, the last time we had a national pandemic that swept through the nation. He was sending out teams of women to teach people how to wash their hands and to, have household hygiene that would cause the pandemic to pass them by. So women were an amazing force in his life. He grew up with a strong mother. He grew up with strong sisters, all of whom were educated and forceful and in their own right. And then he was a champion for women's medicine and for the education of his own daughters, who he, raised to be independent and opinionated and intelligent, forceful women in their own right. So he was really ahead of his time. This was not a default setting for the early 20th century male in any way, shape, or form. And so I think he was really unique in that sense. And I love him for that.
Wonderful. And we had Constance, you had a question.
I have to take off my mute. Hi, Blake.
There she is. Everyone, this is C. Eileen Watts Welch that I have been talking about. I didn't know she was here for sure, but here she is. This is my partner on this amazing journey. And please give her
That's why you
respect due.
My sign says Constance. That's the problem. So the C is now exposed. So I wanted to just ask you to include in part of your description of who established North Carolina Mutual, mention your other great-great-grandfather.
Yes.
And
I
give
certainly
a
will.
moment about it. Yes.
So my other great-great-grandfather is John Merrick, who was John Henry Merrick, who was the other major pillar of the mighty triumvirate that is at the heart of Durham's Black Wall Street. He was originally a barber and opened his own chain of barbershops, and then became also kind of a builder and an entrepreneur in his own right, but then was at the heart of founding particularly the Mutual, but also a building and loan and a number of other enterprises along with Dr. Moore. He was the one who invited Dr. Moore to come and be a physician in Durham when he left medical school. So they must have formed a relationship in Raleigh. Strangely enough, when he was a young man, he was part of the bricklaying team that laid the bricks for the building that became Leonard Medical School. So in so many ways, he built the structure around which Dr. Moore's work could continue. And that was true even from the moment he stepped into medical school. They didn't know each other at that point, but he was working as a bricklayer at that time before he learned the barbering trade. He was really the business acumen. He basically went to the business school of his barber's chair. Many of his clients were, at the time there were no men's clubs in Durham where they could get together and discuss business. So in many ways, the barber's chair became that that kind of atmosphere. And so many of the business tycoons on the white side of town were sitting in John Merrick's barbershop talking business, and he formed lifelong friendships with some of them, and also really gleaned all of his, business acumen from these conversations, along with obviously his own personal genius. And so when he started to really imagine this, prosperous Black middle class, he knew that he needed to recruit people like Dr. Moore to join him in this enterprise. And so there were a number of others that surrounded them who came and went with the various enterprises. But John Merrick and Aaron Moore were really lifelong friends, and were two sides of this real currency of genius and respectability. And on the John Merrick side, he was very affable and great conversationalist. Everyone loved him. He was a big personality. And Dr. Moore was much more retiring and much more cerebral. And so the two of them formed these two pillars of really what made people have confidence in almost anything that they were part of, because they knew that John Merrick was going to make it happen with his charisma and his personality, and they knew that if Dr. Moore was on board, it was a good thing, and that it was trustworthy. And when the mutual was new, they made sure that they paid out of their own pocket if they had a claim. If the business wasn't able to support paying claims just yet, they paid them out of their own pocket. And people knew, they didn't broadcast that, but that got out, that they would guarantee with their own pocketbook what they meant when they said that the mutual would be there when people needed it. And so that built on their ingenuity, this trust. And then C.C. Spalding was the nephew of Aaron Moore, who he helped come up from the country just where he grew up in Columbus County. He helped him come up to Durham and finish his education and work a few jobs, one in a grocery store, to get his feet under him as a businessman. And then when the mutual was really relaunching itself after its initial after John Merrick and Aaron Moore bought out the initial co-conspirators that brought it together and relaunched it, they needed an employee, a designated employee, and C.C. Spalding became that first employee. And so he really learned the mutual from the ground up and became its in many ways, most illustrious president, because he really carried the mutual forward into the 20th century, because he was younger than the two of them. And after John Merrick died and Aaron Moore took over the presidency for a little while, and then his health failed, C.C. Spalding was there to really carry on the legacy of both of them and carry it forward with his business acumen and with his dream and his imagination, having that history in mind.
I just want to give you a chance to clear your voice, your throat.
Thanks.
Yeah. So John Merrick, to let everyone know, John Merrick was actually not as well educated as C.C. Spalding. He was born in slavery. He was a slave when he came to Durham about 5 or 6 years before he convinced Aaron Moore to move here. He was a person who was a born salesman, they would say, and very loving and easy to get to know and smart. He was extremely quick learner. And he partnered with Moore, seeing that they both offset each other's or strengthened each other together, and ended up Moore's daughter and Merrick's son are my grandmother and grandfather. And so that's that connection, how that went on. And the other piece that I want to ask you to speak a little bit more about, if you've got time, is the Rosenwald schools.
Yes.
Just a little. Okay.
The Rosenwald foundation was a philanthropic foundation, Northern Philanthropic Foundation by Julius Rosenwald, that would give matching grants to those who wanted to have a school built in their area. And so they would raise a certain amount of money, and then he would match their grant with their grant, and then send them basically the plans for the school, and they would build it. And so Dr. Moore understood that there was a certain amount of coordination that needed to happen in order to, capture those grants. And so he, with his own money initially, hired a school inspector to go around and determine the need for schools in North Carolina, presented that data to the state, and then was able to assemble teams within each of these communities of people to, raise the money and to capture those grants. And he would put together instruction manuals and have people go out and help people achieve these grants. And so he was instrumental in having more Rosenwald schools built in North Carolina than in any other state. And so that legacy has rippled forward through the generations so very effectively.
I'm going to go to the chat, and this is going to be our last question. I do want to add, though, there are some unanswered questions in the chat, and if other folks do have questions, Blake has generously offered after the fact that we can submit questions on our Caltech Live website, and she will respond to them, and they will be there. So you will be able to be heard and asked and answered.
Very happily.
Now, very happily. How wonderful. Alan had his hand up early, but now it's in the chat, so I'm going to just read it here. Did Dr. Moore's strategy of statesmanship extend to interacting with the state government? I'm wondering how he may have dealt with Charles Aycock, the North Carolina governor, who was also one of the instigators of the Wilmington coup.
Yeah, I don't have evidence that he necessarily interfaced with Aycock. I personally hope not, because that was not a very good man. That being said, I do believe that his statesmanship was largely behind closed doors. He early on in his life decided that he did not want an overtly political stance in his community. He had an initial run for coroner that he was persuaded to take on right out of medical school by his future father-in-law, or his future wife's uncle, a very influential Black political figure, John C. Dancy, persuaded him to take on this campaign for coroner in Durham. And that was met with such vitriol and such a racist reaction, both in the papers and personally. And I believe he was personally threatened as well. That he decided that was not the route he would like to go, and he decided to instead, influence the direction of things, both through his work in the community in stabilizing the lives of the people concerned, but also through relationships that were not political, but that affected the future of his community. And so he preferred to be in the background. He did not prefer to be on the pulpit or on the soapbox. That being said, I do think that there was a certain amount of negotiation. There's allusion to some meetings that happened around the Wilmington coup that perhaps allowed there to be an agreement that certain things would go forward if there was a retraction of effort towards political activism. They would, for instance, stop burning schools. That was happening quite a lot at the time. If people would stop running for office, there's no actual evidence of that, but there's a lot of thought that is surrounding that's what happened. So no, he did not have contact that I know of with Aycock, but he certainly felt the influence of that time and certainly felt the menace of that time and decided to be part of keeping Hayti, Durham's Hayti, safe.
Wonderful. Michael, would you like to close us out?
Thank everybody for joining us. This has been a really wonderful presentation. I want to start off by thanking our stage manager, Ed Brown, our house manager, Corinne Shore. I want to thank Monique Thomas from the Caltech Center for Inclusion and Diversity for hosting this and doing such a wonderful job of talking with our guest. And I really want to thank my friend and our author tonight, Blake Hill Sawyer, for really sharing some really important information with us. A reminder, you can sign up to get further information about our events at events.caltech.edu, and you'll get our infrequent emails about the activities that we've got coming up. The first of which is a weekend with Pablo Picasso. Look for that information online. I'm not going to fill you in with everything detail again here now, but want to let you know that it is important for us at Public Programming to keep these conversations going. And so I thank you all for staying with us through this entire program and for participating in this conversation. We look forward to being with you again. We look forward to you coming into our house as soon as we can open our doors again safely. So thank you very, very much. Good evening.
Thank you for spending time with my family. And thank you, Caltech, for always being on the leading edge of science. And I hope all of you will be on the leading edge of change as well.
Thank you, Blake.
Thank you,
Thank
Monique.
you.
Thanks, Blake.
I'm not on mute.